The island was originally inhabited by werewolves. Locke was Jacob all along. Christian Shepherd is a time-traveling ghost. And of course, the island is a horizon realm in the lower Umbra. There it is! Finally, you found it. It's no longer lost. That's the theory. That's the one theory that just ties it all together into the one thing. What do you mean, what do I mean by horizon realm? And what do you mean, yeah, Burger, I'm not part of the group in the previous joke who don't know what a horizon realm is, in which, of course, there is no shame, as it is like an incredibly niche piece of knowledge. But even armed with my knowledge, what you said doesn't actually explain anything. It's just sort of a vague statement. You're gonna have to contextualize and explain this theory a little bit more. Fine, have 90 minutes of me talking about this. I'm going to explain how and why everything that happens in Lost is best explained as a part of the world of darkness, just like I did with Hannibal a few months ago. And if you don't know what the world of darkness even is, don't worry. Many elements of my theory require a lot of context. I'm going to be providing that context as we go along. I'm going to assume you have seen Lost. If you haven't seen it, go see it. It's very good, and so is the ending, provided you watch the show for the story and the characters, instead of learning the answer to every mystery. The answers you will find here, in this video. And yes, it's true, I am a Lost ending apologist. It could have been better, it should have been better, frankly, but it's not bad. People lambast it like it's the worst thing that ever happened. I'm not going to assume, though, that you know a lot about World of Darkness for this theory. But before we get to that, here's a quick from this video's sponsor, Saucerr. Saucerr is a guy from my Discord server, a longtime patron. He's sponsored a video before, I'm pretty sure, and he doesn't want to sell you anything. He actually wants to gift you something instead. That's right, we're doing a giveaway of 5 digital copies of this thing, my novel, Harm's Place, which is like still on the drive-thru fiction bestseller list ever since launch, basically. Here's how it's gonna work, right? There will be a link in the description, like just the very first link that you see down there is gonna be the link that I mean, and it will lead you to a post on Blue Sky, and it's the post about this very video. All you have to do is share the post. Retweet it, repost it, whatever you want to call it on there. The thing with the arrows and that like goes around, and you become a contestant. 72 hours after this video starts premiering, I will collect all the retweets. If you retweet it after that, I will of course be happy, but you won't enter the raffling. Make sure your Blue Sky DMs are open to people that you follow, and of course also you'll need to follow me as well. Man, almost like that's kind of the point of building my Blue Sky following with this. Because I will be plugging all the retweeters into a random number generator and let it pick 5 of them, which I will then hit up in their DMs and ask for their email addresses. If your Blue Sky DMs are not open to me, I am going to draw someone else instead. I'm sorry, I just have to keep it moving. These email addresses I will then pass along to Saucerr, who will use the drive-thru platform to gift those people digital copies. So like that's all we need from you actually in terms of personal information, is like an email address. And then you'll have a digital copy of Harm's Place, which you can also just buy, but you know, this way you might get it for free. So what is a horizon realm, and why is the island one? And what's the lower Umbra as well? What's the deal with that? These are terms from the World of Darkness. And the World of Darkness is a pen and paper RPG setting that you might know from very famous heavy-hitter games like Vampire the Masquerade, Werewolf the Apocalypse. It's our world, but a bit weirder and darker. It's the World of Darkness after all. And there's all kinds of supernatural stuff going on, like for instance, there being vampires and werewolves. And also mages and ghosts. I actually have in-depth explainers on all of these if you want to dive very deep into the subject matter. This is the rabbit hole of all rabbit holes, I'm telling you. Mages and ghosts, or rather wraiths, are the 2 main types of supernatural beings relevant to this theory, and you don't have to go watch the videos about them. I will explain them to you. Wraiths are pretty easily explained. They are the souls of dead people with unfinished business, trapped in the underworld. Mages are a little more complicated. They are ostensibly human. They don't have any kind of innate supernatural abilities. Except, of course, they do have such immense willpower and strong beliefs that they can reshape reality to conform to those beliefs. They have awakened to the fact that reality is subjective and governed by the force of consensus, which makes true what people believe to be true. At least this is the case for the regular world, the world that you and I inhabit. There's also a number of worlds and world-like spaces that are not limited this way, which are inherently supernatural. Mostly, these hidden dimensions of the supernatural are known as the Umbra. They are distorted reflections of our world that contain a lot of the magical aspects of the setting, and there's actually 3 different Umbrae, each of which has a lot of subdivisions in its own right, and technically there's many more supernatural realms that are not umbral, but that's not so important right now. There's the Upper Umbra, the world of thought and intellect, the Middle Umbra, the world of nature spirits, and the Lower Umbra, also known as the Underworld. You know, the world of the dead and the forgotten, which is the one we care about today. Now, a Horizon Realm is a part of a supernatural world outside the real world that can be accessed from the real world by those who know how to get there. They're also often self-contained to some extent, though that really depends on the Horizon Realm. No two are exactly the same. Mages tend to create and inhabit Horizon Realms because they can more easily control the local reality, which helps a lot with their magic. Means of getting to certain Horizon Realms may be like a classic magic portal that stands somewhere and it needs to be activated with a code phrase, and then that leads to a castle in deep space. Or it's like a tropical island, and you need extremely elaborate mathematics to find it in space-time and then go there with certain, people and resonances to arrive. Or you can just take a submarine. So am I saying the island was created? And if so, who created it? If Horizon Realms are created by mages? Well, the answer to that is yes and no, and I'm not sure. The underworld is made up of dead things, right? Things that no longer exist. And the more these things are forgotten, the deeper into the underworld they sink. You have the Shadowlands, which are an amalgam of remembered places, some of which are places that still exist, but people remember them because they see them all the time. But many of which are also places that don't exist anymore, but which people still remember. And yes, that does mean that the Twin Towers are still in the Shadowlands version of New York. As they are forgotten, things drift down to the Sunless Sea, which is a tempest-racked ocean where they form islands. Though rarely traditional-looking islands, it must be said, they're more like anachronistic mosaics of buildings throughout time. Then under the surface, you have the Labyrinth, where the memories are incoherent. It's sort of a massive trash heap of places you can descend into. And then, at the bottom of the underworld, there is Oblivion. An infinite black maw that consumes all of reality forever, always eating away at the labyrinth. So perhaps at one point in time, the island was a real volcanic island that really existed, but it was destroyed somehow, presumably by itself. It is, after all, a volcano, and so became part of the underworld. It drifted down from the Shadowlands into the Sunless Sea, where it remains to this day. Who knows if it was ever inhabited by people in the real world, though I do suspect that it was, and also that the people who lived there were werewolves. But there have been a great number of volcanic islands throughout history, and because the island is clearly very special, I'm willing to put out there the idea that it may have been created in the underworld as well. But even if it wasn't, it's hard to put it in a specific place. Obviously the filming location was Hawaii, but it may have started anywhere because given that it travels around the world, it could have been colonized by various life forms over time, and you have a rather eclectic sort of jungle mix of various different plants and animals. In the underworld, the island definitely did start being inhabited. Some prehistoric mage, or perhaps a whole group of them, must have discovered it and began using it as a horizon realm. When I say discovered, I mean sort of like Columbus-style discovered. There were, or as I said earlier, probably already werewolves living there. Now, who these mages were, I couldn't say. The oldest location on the whole island is clearly the hidden Cave of Light at the end of the creek behind the bamboo field, the heart of the island. The whole mechanism in there looks downright prehistoric. There must have been several generations of mages and people they brought with them, which mages often do, by the way, because it can create a sort of mini consensus where their magic works better, and because it safeguards them against other mages with different belief systems. Something that certainly seems to fuel Jacob's power is having a group of people who believe he is some sort of deific figure with a grand plan. And so because they believe that, it makes it so. It's also just useful to have people around, just to sort of hang out with when you need dental work done, hot dogs, someone to have a hot dog stand. And then other mages show up with different cults, and they must have warred each other, made peace, done extinction, driven people off the island. You know, just the usual type of stuff that you do in such a situation. The temple that we see throughout season 6 is hard to ascribe to just one culture. It's a very eclectic mix of various cultures, which makes it plausible that it was actually built by a somewhat diverse group and altered over the course of several generations. There were definitely Egyptians on the island for a while, as evidenced by the gigantic Sobek statue that only a foot of remains now. Given its placement, I reckon it served as a sort of signaling post for those Egyptian mages to travel to and from the island. Sobek is a deity associated with the River Nile, which these ancient Egyptian navigators may have used to get to the island. Who says it needs to be in the ocean? Though, given that the Egyptian underworld, which is just a different area of the lower Umbra, is not a huge storm-racked ocean, but a vast and unforgiving desert, I can also imagine that they trekked into the desert with these sort of huge caravans, and their seers were able to distinguish fake mirages from the real deal by the presence of Sobek and his dominion over the river and all its life-giving qualities. It's also a perfect symbolic residence for the protector of the island to live in, because Sobek is a protective deity who wards off the forces of evil. Which, of course, is in the eye of the beholder. Often it turns out that evil just mainly means competition. I don't know that specifically Romans ever represented a major faction on the island, though it would surprise me if they had played no role at all. Yes, the people the earliest period that we get to see on the island do speak Latin, but that doesn't actually mean much, since the dominance of the Roman Empire, many different peoples used it as a means to communicate the way we use English now. However, we do witness the birth of Jacob, who is named Jacobus by his mother, which is a Latinized version of a Hebrew name that only started appearing in that form in the late Roman period, so 300-ish to 600-ish after the birth of Christ. I'm not sure that it ends up being Jacob's native tongue. The woman who raises him clearly speaks it, and it would be sort of neat if this was because she is from the early Roman period. It does clearly hold a very symbolic and perhaps mystical connotation to him, which is why all his followers learned to speak it as well. It did stop being the trade language eventually, so it would no longer have been simply a choice of pragmatism to keep it around as a ways of talking to people over the centuries. And people to talk to over the centuries, there certainly would be. Even within the context of World of Darkness, the island is a place of exceptional power and value. Because the island is not like other places in the underworld. This is, of course, one of the core conflicts of the television show as well, right? The constant factionalism, antagonism, paranoia about new arrivals coveting the island. Every atrocity is justified with, oh, we're protecting the island. It's made clear that this conflict has been going on for a very, very long time. And really, the entire story of Lost happens because of this conflict. As we find out, the survivors of Oceanic 815 crashed on the island because they were brought there by Jacob, who is, of course, if you hadn't guessed, an incredibly powerful mage descended from a line of mages who have controlled the island for such a long time that they have figured out how to attune themselves to its power in a way that no other faction has managed. And Jacob brings people to the island not just for his personal cult, but as part of an incredibly elaborate scheme to save the island from his own massive fuck-up. The price of arrogance and hubris, of course, being a major theme in Mage the Ascension as well. But what makes the island so special? Well, first of all, the obvious thing, it's alive. It's not just a place made of forgotten memories. It's a location deep in the underworld that is actually teeming with legitimate life, as any self-respecting tropical island should. It has sort of a blister that makes it seem much more like the real world than a location in the underworld. The place is suffused with a powerful healing energy that doesn't just accelerate wound healing and protects everyone from disease, it undoes deadly conditions and permanent disabilities. John Locke was in a wheelchair for years before the island restored him to his old self, in a matter of seconds. Rose had cancer that no medicine or magic could cure, and the island just nuked it like it was nothing. The island is full of locations that contain vast amounts of pure, magical quintessence. Nodes, to put it in mage terms, that should be infinitely rare because of the sheer power that they hold, but just pop up here like free samples at Costco's. It's not just the heart of the island, it's the Swan Station, the Orchid Station, the Healing Well and the Temple, and who knows how many other places. The Dharma Initiative is just the latest in a long line of magical groups that have sought to wrest control of the island from Jacob and his faction. So you might ask why I think it's in the underworld at all, if it's such a lively, alive type of place. There's plenty other locations that Horizon Realms could be in after all. First of all, the ghosts. There's a ton of them. A huge number of wraiths, to use the technical term. Pretty much everyone who dies on the island becomes a wraith. Now, they don't just seamlessly mingle with the living, which again suggests that there is some sort of gauntlet, a barrier between the living and the dead, which is unusual for the underworld. It would also explain why, when you just sort of like leave the island, you don't arrive in the sunless sea, but stay in the waters around the island like it's a snow globe. And I think maybe that this blister was created by Jacob in order to curtail the power of his brother and antagonist, who, as we can tell, has dominion over the dead. But it's not as strong as the gauntlet in the real world, so it's clearly not the same thing. And the presence of all this life energy clearly affects the wraiths as well. They seem particularly lively here, able to change their corpus much more seamlessly, less inclined to taking on the sort of morbid forms that wraiths off the island tend to. But my bigger piece of evidence is that, aside from all the magical energies, the island is clearly also suffused with Jhor. Gotta explain that one to you. Jhor is in many ways the opposite of the energies of creation that flow through the island. Jhor is the energy of death and decay, the energy of entropy and oblivion, and the underworld is basically made of it. Jhor strengthens your shadow, the darkest and most vile element of your soul. Jhor is the reason why pregnancy does not work on the island. There's just too much death energy around for the creation of new life. And I think this has always been a limiting factor on the societies that live there. Jacob brings new people to the island all the time instead of simply maintaining a steady population and isolating it from the rest of the world. In fact, he himself, of course, was brought to the island by the woman we know only as Mother. She brought a highly pregnant woman here just to get her replacement. If you want people not to know about your magic island, it would seem smarter to avoid bringing people there all the time. Like, word's gonna get out and someone will figure out how to get there and then they'll do it. So there needs to be a reason why that was being done. The Dharma Initiative as well had their women give birth on the mainland, but sometimes in the case of Ethan, a full pregnancy and birth actually did work for them, though that one was very much accidental. This is because the Dharma people inoculated themselves against Jhor with those vaccines, the purpose of which is never really explained. Most of the people who make use of them don't seem to know what it is that they do, which is likely because they have no actual concept of Jhor in their limited worldview. It is explained by various characters at various points that there is a sickness on the island that makes people evil. This is what happened to Rousseau's crew. We literally see that sickness in action. They become just terrible for no reason. The same thing happens with Claire, and actually there is a reason, and it's the same reason in both cases. They were all exposed to the artist formerly known as the Smoke Monster. Not that Rousseau herself has necessarily sort of maintained high moral standards over the years. The point is, usually the sickness doesn't just happen suddenly. It's a sneaking process that occurs whether one is exposed to the Smoke Monster or not. And we have a control group for this experiment. The Dharma people spent years on the island, but aside from the fact that a lot of them are like weird and eccentric, they are by and large pretty normal people in terms of their morality. The survivors who spent several years with them in the 70s presumably got the same inoculations, so they were fine. Rose and Bernard didn't get those inoculations, but unlike Claire, they were not exposed to the Smoke Monster, and honestly, maybe too good and pure to be corrupted. But even those two are not as kind as they used to be. They have become quite a bit more selfish. Perhaps to a reasonable extent, right? They were very altruistic, but they have changed. The others, on the other hand, are kind of sociopaths. I mean, they play house and everything, but they have very little in the way of moral qualms when it comes to manipulating, abducting, maiming, and killing people. Very few of them have a strong moral compass, and I don't think they started out this way. It seems to me that their strategy of purging Jhor is to spend periods of time on the mainland, which is not necessarily super effective if you want to be doing that. A great example of this is Juliet, who comes to the island as an incredibly innocent and kind person. And though she retains the core of that personality 3 years later, when we meet her in the story, she has a deeply cold side to her. Like, she's willing and able to kill people to advance her own agenda. The Jhor has clearly gotten to her. Which is ironic because the whole reason she was brought to the island in the first place was to counteract the problematic effects that Jhor has on pregnancy. Because Juliet is herself a mage. And yes, many mages are not mystics, but enlightened scientists, as they call themselves, that do very out there and impossible things, like for instance developing treatments to allow women who should be completely incapable of pregnancy become pregnant, but they do it with science. The Dharma Initiative had their own vaccine, which actually Desmond also has access to, which is why he did not deteriorate morally while down in the Swan Station. But the others don't. Juliet clearly has developed some kind of medical cocktail to replace the Dharma injections, but that stuff is recent and not ready yet. She probably doesn't think of the problem as a mystical energy of entropy, and that may be part of what's stalling her progress, but she did go for the same basic approach of creating an inoculation. And I mean, at the heart of all this evil is, of course, Benjamin Linus. I could talk about this guy for a long time. He is, in my opinion, one of the best villains. Michael Emerson is just such a phenomenal actor, playing such a phenomenally well-written character. Here's the thing, right? The reason Ben Linus is this, evil, heartless, calculating sociopath is on one hand, his own ambition and intellect, but also Jhor. We meet Ben as a kid when he and his abusive dad join the Dharma Initiative on the island, and he shows no signs of being a little psycho. He's just a kid, a kind kid even, a kid who is stuck with a real piece of shit father and who still goes out of his way to take care of people. A kid who really just wants out of his domestic hell. But when Saeed shoots him in hopes of ensuring that the entire plot of Lost doesn't happen, he's saved by Richard Alpert, who brings him to the temple and its healing pool. Now, this healing pool is not actually made just of pure quintessence. It's merely a concentrated mix of the island's magical atmosphere. So while there is enough life force in there to heal even grievous wounds, it's also full of Jhor. And Richard knows this, which is why he warns everyone that Ben will be a different person when he comes back. That shock infusion of Jhor, as part of his healing process, made him into who he then became. The same thing happened to Saeed later, right? Except because the protector of the island was dead at that time, the life spring was unbalanced and leaning all the more heavily toward Jhor. Dorgan and Lennon even remark on this when they see it. They think it's a problem. It's probably the quickest we ever see the sickness take hold. And it happens because in that moment, Saeed's soul is entirely overtaken by his innermost darkness, which for him manifests as total apathy. This also explains why Ben Linus is the only person on the island that eventually got cancer. Not only is he saturated with Jhor, he rarely, if at all, even left the island to get rid of at least some of it. And this matters, I think the temple also, like the energies that like rain down there into the pool kind of cleanse the temple of some of the Jhor. I don't think he spent a lot of time in the temple either, because he wouldn't have been like the leader. Someone else is in charge of the temple, even if that person kind of answers to Ben. Speaking of Richard, by the way, here's an interesting case, because he's been on the island for a long time without becoming a complete psycho. But it makes perfect sense that he would be immune, or at least unbelievably resistant to Jhor, because, I mean, he's immortal. Not only was he touched by Jacob, who is resistant to Jhor because he's innately connected to the life force of the island, Jacob solidified the essence of Richard to an extent that it became much more permanent. This ability will become important later down the theory. Over the course of the 200 years that Richard spends on the island, he doesn't really change all that much as a person, just like a little bit. And we're not even sure that that's really a change. We see him in like an extreme crisis situation when we see him as a human being. He may just generally have been a very chill guy. A very interesting case of Jhor exposure we see doesn't even happen on the island itself. It happens on Charles Whitmore's freighter. The ship is in the vicinity of the island, but not quite there. So it's exposed to the fraying edges between reality and underworld without the positive life energies of the island counteracting their exposure. That's why morale deteriorates so quickly there. They are all overtaken by their darkest selves. The whole time travel thing that happens there, by the way, is not related to Jhor, but has something to do with like the time mechanisms on which the island moves around, which at the fringes is going to blast people with a lot of temporal paradox. But a little more on that later. Okay, so the island is in the underworld, but why is it so special that everybody covers it? And how does that lead to the plot of the show happening? Well, to put it plainly, it's all this guy's fault. There's a point where Jacob talks about how many years ago he made a huge mistake, and this is what turned his brother into a mortal enemy and also a smoke monster. And while it may seem as though the terrible consequence is like a blood feud between brothers that kept on going for centuries, it's actually much bigger than that. Because again, Mage has a running theme of if you have incredible power, you better not mess up, because you will create incredible consequences. And boy is Jacob a powerful mage. As an explainer, obviously not all mages have the same level of power. And power in Mage is measured in terms of a depth of understanding of the malleable nature of reality, paired with the mastery of one's own technique and the confidence with which one exerts one's will. The game Mage divides reality into 9 spheres, each representing a particular aspect of reality. Like for instance, forces being about energy, correspondence being about space, and spirit being about the unseen world. Even the most powerful mages specialize only in a small number of these spheres, and for Jacob, the sphere he has mastered to an incredible extent is entropy. Now, classic entropists are necromancers, but the sphere is also known by a different name, Fortuna, the sphere of chance. Which of course makes perfect sense because that's what entropy is. It's a breakdown of order from which chaos emerges. And if you can reverse that, you can create order from chaos. Having control over that means you have control over the forces of coincidence itself. And it should be self-evident why that is powerful. Now, of course, entropy is not the only sphere Jacob knows, it's just his most powerful one. And it can even stop you from aging, because aging is a breakdown of order in your system. And if you can ensure that events that destroy order in your system never occur, you will not age. Richard's immortality definitely works this way. Whenever he would be in a lethal situation, he just so happens to survive by sheer coincidence. Something unlikely happens that saves his life. And the same is true about Jacob's candidates, though I'm not sure if they're technically immortal. It starts with them surviving a plane crash against unspeakable odds, and runs through the narrative with them surviving even more unlikely situations, especially in the later seasons, where they eventually gain a level of awareness of their invulnerability for the final stretch. This explains why coincidence is such a powerful force in this show in general, why all the characters are connected in the ways they are. We find out at the lighthouse that Jacob has always been watching them. He deliberately wove them together through fate. Now, of course, not all the Oceanic 815 survivors were candidates, and not all the candidates were Oceanic 815 survivors. If you're going to unmake an omelette, you're going to have to uncrack a few eggs. It's pretty clear that there were literally hundreds of candidates over a period of time that may have lasted centuries. And the reason Jacob does this is to find a replacement for himself, a successor to the office of Protector of the Island, which isn't just an empty title, but actually a metaphysical quality that attunes a person to the reservoirs of quintessence on the island. In the show, this is called electromagnetism. It's the same thing, basically. This is an incredibly important office, and he needs to make sure that the right person for the job ends up getting it. Someone who is able, willing, and ready to do it. Every mage has different instruments that they use to manifest magic, and these tools, rules, and techniques they adhere to depend on their particular worldview. This could mean that you manifest your magic through prayer because you think prayer works, or chemistry because you think chemistry can do impossible things, or the carving of runes, or the power of social domination. It depends on what you believe. The more powerful a mage gets, the fewer instruments they require to work their magic, because they understand more and more that the real power to change reality flows from them and their will, and the instruments are just intuitive ways for them to manifest that. Jacob, being as powerful as he is at a point where he just sort of needs to touch a guy in order to give him eternal life. But he started the spell to find his candidates centuries ago, and it's immensely complex, so clearly he utilized other tools as well. Like, for instance, numbers and names, pretty common as far as instruments go. He must have spent extended periods in that cave with the names, just sort of meditating or like doing arcane mathematics. Maybe he channeled those names by observing the distant permutations of fate, or maybe he manifested these people into existence in the first place. He needed a large number of candidates because he was trying to create order from chaos, right? He had to first create the random noise that would lead to his desired outcome. Like reverse causality, if you will. He filled a box with random Legos and shook them for so long that they assembled themselves into the exact set he wanted. This is why the numbers 4, 8, 15, 16, 23, 42 are so immensely powerful in this universe. It's the final sequence of the order emergent from the chaos. The viable candidates who end up most closely tied together by the power of this spell. I don't know why 6 numbers exactly, not 5 or 7. I like to think it's because Hurley, not Jack, would become the 6th protector of the island, which was the ultimate actual point of the spell. That's right. He wasn't aligning fate for number 5, his replacement. He very consciously aligned his esoteric mathematics onto the number 6, his replacement's replacement. And just to get this out of the way, even if Jacob knew these numbers and was able to interpret them, he would not have been able to act on that knowledge, because rules are clearly part of his instruments, and then the spell would not have worked. So when he tells Kate that she can have the job if she wants to, pretty sure he's lying. What this means for this particular series of numbers is that they are a chaos stopper, so powerful that they sort of reverberate through time and space. The Dharma Initiative used these numbers to literally control a buildup of chaotic energy in the Swan Station by putting them into a computer system every 108 minutes which just so happens to be what they add up to. The Dharma Initiative probably understood the problem they were trying to contain after the Swan Station catastrophe on like a metaphysical level, and in an effort to create a long-term sustainable solution for their problem, may have used arcane mathematics themselves to find these numbers that stop chaos dead in its tracks. It's probably also why they decided to broadcast those numbers. Both Hurley and Sam Toomey, who is a character that we never see, used the numbers in a game of chance, so of course they won. When used in the real world in the context of chaos, because the numbers are inherently magical, they generate a huge amount of paradox backlash. If you don't know, paradox is the mean left hook of consensus. Consensus is the consensual reality that people in a given place agree upon. Things that fall outside of consensus cannot happen. Except a mage's belief in their own paradigm is so powerful that it can override consensus. However, if they do this in an overt way, paradox hits and punishes the mage. The punishment ranges from like mild and ironic, like that one time I tried to manifest a spell that would allow me to read people's auras, and my character suffered from face blindness for a week. Or like the reality cops might show up as a paradox spirit and put you in reality prison. None of that is metaphorical, by the way. Now, when you are in a horizon realm, paradox is not really a problem because consensus only reaches outside the real world when there's a significant population of sleepers present. Sleepers being like regular people. This is also why all the most powerful mages need to be extremely careful when they go to Earth. Otherwise, Paradox might, send them to Paradox jail. Jacob does go to the real world several times, and presumably he uses overtly magical means to do so. Richard also spends time in the mortal world, and though he is not a mage, he is the product of a mage and should be affected by Paradox to some extent. Except, of course, there are ways of mitigating and avoiding Paradox. The first and simplest is just to not attract attention. Jacob goes out of his way to blend in and act normal when in the real world. Wearing appropriate attire, learning the proper languages and cultural norms, he blends in as much as possible. He does this because he needs to touch the people he uses his magic on. And though that touch is part of a magic spell, it doesn't trigger Paradox because it's like just the act of touching someone. There's like nothing inherently unbelievable about it. The other means of avoiding Paradox is by cancelling it out with the utilization of quintessence, pure magical energy, which requires certain knowledge of the prime sphere and which Jacob, being from the island where literally every drop of water is sort of loaded with quintessence, is not exactly short on. However, the lives of both Hurley and Sam Toomey are ruined by unlikely events of bad luck happening all around them. This is Paradox trying to correct the absorption of chaos by creating that chaos everywhere, but because neither Hurley nor Sam use the numbers as part of a magic spell, they themselves are not punished directly. They are also under the reality stabilizing influence of the numbers. I'd say it's possible that the manifestation of these numbers in the world was intended by Jacob to sort of act as a paradox heatsink. Who knows where else they have caused chaos? But why these people, right? What makes a candidate a candidate? Well, Jacob wants to be replaced with a mage. Consequently, a candidate also needs to be a mage. But hang on, all the factions of mage are constantly trying to predict where a mage will show up, and none have reliably done it. How has Jacob done this with literally hundreds of them? Well, he hasn't. Mages are still incredibly rare people. But he has identified hundreds of people who could awaken to becoming mages. All of the candidates are people with immense willpower. I'm serious. They're all pretty exceptional when it comes to this. They are, of course, deeply flawed people still, but they have, persevered through some incredible stuff. John Locke had, just a hideous life and decided to go on a walkabout even though he sits in a wheelchair. Saeed is a horribly scarred war veteran who still manages to fight for his own redemption. Sawyer held a grudge all his life so incredibly intensely that he became the grudge. Jin and Sun got together in a deeply classist society and stayed together in a horrible marriage. Jack was in medical school and only became an alcoholic. Even Hurley, you might assume he's just just kind of a guy. But the fact that he keeps on carrying his kindness into a world that so deeply and elaborately fucks him again and again requires immense willpower as well. It requires an immense strength of character. Some of the candidates are actually already awakened mages, in my opinion. I mentioned Juliet, who is a candidate. Her name appears in the lighthouse. She is the number 58. She uses medical science to manifest life sphere effects. Kate, number 51, not one of the Ultimate Six because she effectively adopted a child and can thus not care for the island, has been on the run from the police for like a decade, pulling just incredible criminal gambits, by which I mean incredible as in not credible. Like, at least not often as is implied. It's like insane the shit she gets away with. I think she has a permanent mind effect going on that makes people want to help her even at their own expense. And we even see her avatar in this show, the manifestation of her inner awakened self, which is the black horse she encounters upon her awakening, and later on the island when she is on a sort of quest to understand herself better. This is called a seeking. This is something that mages do. Hurley may have actually rejected his awakening at one point, though given that his avatar Dave, returns to him on the island, suggests to me that the method of teaching this particular avatar uses is to trick him into learning the right lesson. So he didn't reject it after all. His ability to speak to ghosts, it's probably sort of a magical effect, though mediums who are not awakened mages do exist in the world of darkness. Daniel Faraday and Charlotte Lewis are both candidates, and also, like their colleague Miles, awakened mages. These three may actually be the most powerful of the candidate mages that we see, but even they are mostly caught in their own worldview, right? They have no conscious understanding yet that they are altering reality through force of will. So yes, the reason why Miles reads the final thoughts of the dead while Hurley talks to ghosts is because Miles doesn't believe that you can talk to ghosts. Having the potential to awaken doesn't necessarily mean that you will awaken. In fact, most people who could awaken don't. But in case the candidates don't awaken by the time they need to take the job, Jacob still has an ace up his sleeve. The ritual to make someone into the protector of the island just floods you with pure quintessence. If you are on the verge of awakening, that'll stir you out of your slumber. I think he knows this because it worked on him. And it's not the water that's filled with quintessence, by the way, in the ritual that made him into a mage. It's the symbolism that bestows you the metaphysical quality of being the protector of the island, which immediately connects you to all of that quintessence. Crucially, actually, I don't think this ritual is an act of real magic, like with a CK instead of just a C at the end. I think it's a rote technique developed by whoever created the office of protector of the island. This is why Jack is able to perform the ritual despite clearly not being a master of the prime sphere. He really does just have to perform the hand movements to make it happen. And you know, that's all well and good. But I don't think finding a replacement is the only thing that Jacob's ritual is meant to do. I think the real reason why Jacob goes to such immense lengths to set in motion such an unspeakably convoluted series of events that reaches across time and space itself, and which touches potentially thousands of people, is because it also serves a secret second purpose. And that purpose is the reason why he feels like he needs to be replaced in the first place. To kill his brother, who is the greatest danger the island has ever seen. And also to, wage war on him in general. Many of the candidates that don't end up replacing Jacob still end up on the island doing some useful thing for Jacob's plans. His brother's name isn't Esau. He doesn't actually have a name. Some people call him the Man in Black. I like the name Esau as a counterpart to Jacob. He wants to destroy the island, which is notably quite different from the other factions that have fought over the island across the eons, because they were trying to control the island, which is what makes him the biggest threat the island has ever seen. I think that during his mortal existence, Esau was actually a decently powerful mage. It was his mother, Claudia, who brought him to her people, and while there he must have met other mages who aided him in his awakening. In which case it might be argued that Claudia is actually not a ghost, but his avatar, but like, who knows with these things. He was certainly skilled in the correspondence spheres, perhaps also time, given that he develops the mechanism with which the island can be moved through time and space. Though of course it might also be that this mechanism only manipulates the island's innate ability to do so. In his conversation with Jacob, he talks about there being men in his village who understand how things work, which to me not only implies that they are mages, but perhaps mages who base their worldview on reason instead of mysticism. This is important because the conflict between these two approaches is also central to the mage gameline. The rationalistic, enlightened scientists of the technocracy stand against the superstitious mystics of the traditions in the Ascension War. Now, of course, this is a long time before the technocracy came to be. But, I mean, the technocracy didn't just pop up out of nowhere. There were groups for a long time who believed in a set of universal laws governing the universe as opposed to miracles. It also implies that Jacob is not a mage at this point yet. He's not awakened. In the episode where we learn his backstory, Mother, by which I mean not Claudia, but the woman who killed her, talks to Esau about how Jacob is not like them. I think that this refers to the fact that both she and Esau are mages, but Jacob isn't. However, Mother did know that he must be the one who succeeds her because he's the better person. Mage or no, just as a guy, he was more suited to the position. He may have known some secrets of the island, but Jacob only really awakened to his magical potential during the ritual. And this is not necessarily like visually impressive, because the paradigm these people adhere to includes the idea that magic is subtle and inside of all things, which is a much more traditional way of understanding magic. If you believe that the world is full of magic, it's easier to explain things that happen around you as magic. We, in our modern day and age, have other explanations for these phenomena. We call them mundane. So what we think of as magic needs to justify itself by being inherently like supernatural looking with flashy lights and choral music. Which is where we finally come to why the island is such a special locale in the first place. In the world of darkness, beyond all systems of belief, there is a fundamental triarchy of three forces in the universe. Mages call these three forces dynamism, stasis, and entropy. Werewolves personify them in the spirits of the wild, the weaver, and the worm. You have to understand that in the world of darkness, everything is based on people's own perspective, and they will use different words to describe the same thing because they conceptualize of it differently. It's still the same thing. Most mages consider these forces to be impersonal. Werewolves think they're like really the big spirits that control the universe. Both are equally correct and incorrect. The wild is a force of pure creation, mutation, and potential. Everything that is comes from its raw energies. The weaver is a stabilizing force, giving things permanence, creating order from the wild's chaotic wellspring of infinite creation. The worm destroys, breaks down, and decays everything that exists, converting it back to the state of pure nothingness that the wild creates everything from. The central conflict in Werewolf is to fight the worm before it destroys the world. This is necessary because eons ago the Weaver trapped the worm because it wanted to stop it from destroying the order that it had created. This drove the worm mad and corrupted it, so it's now a force of evil and filth that unbalances the triad. And everything is always focused on that aspect of the conflict. Sometimes we see the Weaver stabilizing the dynamic action of the wild through like pattern weaving spiders in the middle umbra, but we never see the nothingness emptied by the worm turned into everythingness by the wild. And that step of the process is what I believe the island is. That's why I am so convinced that it is located in the underworld. Oblivion, the all-consuming maw at the bottom of the lower umbra, is a manifestation of the worm, of entropy. Jacob describes this when he explains what the island is to Richard. The evil that is supposedly in the bottle is the worm, or rather oblivion. And the island is a location where that nothingness pushes itself outward, a void of potential to be transformed into raw creation by the wild. And once upon a time, this may have been a naturally regulated process, yes, but because the worm has been corrupted, this pocket of overflowing oblivion is trying to push itself out into the world. What happens at the source is that the island, sitting on the underworld and thus collecting all that falls down, has all the spent quintessence, all the used up magical potential rain onto it. Still a lot of energy in that left, but it is mostly spent. It's all over the island, of course, but ultimately, it all ends up in this particular stream that flows down into the cave. And in this mechanism, the upwelling of nothingness from oblivion is filtered through the cork, imbuing that spent quintessence with new, pure, concentrated magical potential. And then it flows away through these channels into the many reservoirs on the island, and from there it is projected into the world. I couldn't tell you how exactly, but I reckon it is like projected into the higher umbra. Maybe it's distributed through like the world traveling mechanism of the island, who knows. Aside from one irregular outpouring of energy when the Swan Station blows up, of course, that's sort of a big deal. But it would make sense that perhaps it wouldn't have been noticed that much in the World of Darkness, and why there's no World of Darkness lore event there, because this was after the Avatar storm and like weird shit was happening with the Umbra all the time. I think this mechanism wasn't there back when things worked normally, like before the worm was corrupted. And it must have been built by the protectors of Gaia. These may have been mages, but they were probably werewolves. Maybe the first protectors of the island were werewolves and not mages at all. It's certainly the kind of mission that they would undertake and a tradition that they would establish. It would be a classic World of Darkness move if mages had eventually found the place, coveted it, killed or displaced the werewolves, and eventually figured out that their tradition of wanting to guard the island was actually kind of a good idea from the get-go. In fact, I might entertain the possibility that this war between mages and werewolves is what brought the island to the underworld in the first place. I highly doubt that it was initially a collaboration between mages and werewolves, given that werewolves back then famously hated anything non-werewolf, even other shape changes, and to a large extent they still do. They can barely collaborate with each other, much less someone who isn't a werewolf. I doubt the island is the only Wildspring location in the universe, but it is one of them. And you might be asking, well, but if the Maw of Oblivion exists in the underworld, why doesn't entropy just act through there? And, well, that's kind of what's happening. It is literally there to consume all that has been forgotten forever, but it's also very deep within the labyrinth of detritus that sits underneath the surface of the underworld. Whereas the island itself, while still in the underworld, is much more connected to the rest of the universe. It's literally a volcano. It's a place where lava was able to melt upwards through the mantle. It's literally a conduit. It acts like as a metaphorical conduit for energies from below to go above, which would be of great interest to a corrupted worm. And also, crucially, Oblivion, which again is an aspect of the worm, has an agent on the island. Which is how we come back to Esau. So after Mother kills his town and ruins his little wheel project, which I assume he later manipulates other people into realizing, he goes and kills Mother, and then Jacob doesn't kill him, but instead brings him to the heart of the island and chucks him down into the light. Mother explicitly warned them that doing so would result in a fate worse than death, and that's exactly what happens, but what was Jacob supposed to do? He can't kill Esau. Esau's soul emerges once again as a column of black smoke. So we talked before about wraiths, and I think we need to go into a little more detail here. As alluded to before, every wraith has a shadow, a darker self that torments them and tries to move them to take the worst possible action and destroy themselves in a way that causes as much damage as possible to everyone around them, and so this way they can consign as many souls as possible to oblivion. The shadows are self-interested, but they are active agents of oblivion. A wraith where the shadow is dominant over the psyche is known as a spectre, and those are even more explicit agents of oblivion. Sometimes the most powerful and resourceful spectres become assimilated into oblivion in such a way that they transform into something else entirely. A Malfian. The most powerful Malfians are never born. Esau would be a once-born Malfian, someone who was once human. He fits the bill personality-wise. He's desperate, vengeful, a murderer, disconnected from the community around him, which he despises even though he lives with them. Just overall bit of a prick. His divine aspect, his avatar, is burned away in the process. He can no longer do proper magic, though he retains all his knowledge and understanding, which I conjecture, given that he was a correspondence mage, helped him develop the ability to teleport around the island. His obsession with leaving the island instantly became an obsession with destroying it, not because he actually reasoned that he must do so in order to escape, but because Oblivion has put this conclusion into his head. Malfeans have immense power over ghosts, which the island is of course full of, and which are the primary means by which Esau manipulates the mortals who land on the island into doing his bidding. In fact, the power to control ghosts against their will, basically ghostwriting them, is hardly something only Malfeans know how to do. It's not a common skill, but it's not super rare either. However, we also see these ghosts act of their own volition, suggesting that it's not just Esau impersonating them. They are really here in the remarkable underworld conditions of the island. Had there been like incursions of specters and Malfeans in the past, the mages protecting the island would have been able to just fight them back. But of course, the problem is that because of Mother's spell, neither Esau nor Jacob can kill one another. Jacob can't actually destroy this threat that he has created. But they can, and do, both play the long game against each other. Jacob can be killed at any time, which is why he keeps away from his own cult of followers. Esau has nothing to offer but pain, which is why he needs to be very clever in his manipulations. And we never see Jacob do much in the way of manipulation, but we know he's doing it, which kind of makes him the greater manipulator of the two. Of course, he has bent fate to his side. He knows that when he takes opportunities that present themselves to him, it's the puzzle pieces falling into place. There's a flashback scene to a few centuries ago where Esau tells Jacob that it always ends the same when he brings people to the island, whereas Jacob remarks that it only ends once. Everything before that was just progress. This is a perfect encapsulation of the arrogance and cynicism with which a Malfean would regard a mortal mage, even one as powerful as Jacob. Esau is under the impression that Jacob is making new moves again and again, but in fact, Jacob is running a scheme that goes way beyond what Esau expects from him. But Jacob needs to play the fool to a certain extent. He needs Esau to feel confident that he can outmaneuver Jacob. Because in order for Jacob's plan to work, Esau needs to find a way to kill him. Yeah, dying was always part of the plan, and though Miles says to Ben about Jacob, that he was hoping until the last moment that he was wrong about him, I don't think this means that he didn't intend to die. He just hoped it wouldn't be Ben who kills him, probably because he had other personal aspirations for the guy, hoped he could be cleansed of his Jhor, healed of his sociopathy, which I guess ultimately did end up happening, but through Hurley. One of the things about Jacob is that he fundamentally believes in the goodness of people, which is ultimately like a move he pulls often. And it's a move that Esau doesn't understand. Even when he's dying, in his final moment, he warns Esau, now wearing the body of John Locke, that Charles Widmore is coming. And also, like in a more immediate sense, Jacob's bodyguards, but they are ultimately pretty inconsequential, I suppose, at least to us. They have some very essential butterfly effect type work to do. They put the right people in the right places, but they are ultimately a distraction. This was his final direct move after centuries of playing the nice guy with his brother. Esau thinks Jacob is weak, and so of course he would believe a last-second sort of regret out of misplaced brotherly love. But Jacob brought Charles Widmore back to the island as a feint. Widmore is himself a mage, I believe, a formidable foe, one that Jacob was desperate enough to bring back because Esau was winning. And the candidates are just fools and tools that Esau can easily play against each other. They're just people. Widmore even has other mages working for him. He's dangerous. But it's the candidates that ultimately end up being Esau's undoing. Because there were always going to be two candidates who make it. And the first one was going to sacrifice himself so Esau could be killed in the moment where he'd be most vulnerable. When Desmond ends up pulling the plug that acts as the regulator that allows the wild to transform entropy into dynamism, the entropy begins flooding out into the island. Esau becomes killable. He ceases to be a Malfian and becomes effectively mortal, which seems like something that shouldn't be possible, especially with this turn of events. But you forget, mages can make anything possible. This explanation of what happens is gonna get a little bit metaphysical and weird, because the trick Jacob pulls off to turn Esau mortal in this precise moment utilizes the Prime Sphere, which we have already established Jacob is adept at using, we just haven't explained what it is. And of all the spheres, I think Prime is definitely the most complicated and least easily explained. It's the sphere of magic itself. The metaphysical qualities of things, the manipulation of pure magical energies, the sublime patterns that define what a thing is beyond what it represents itself as, the genes to the expression, right? Kabbalists might refer to it as Keter, if you're familiar with that tradition. Philosophers might call these things like Platonic ideals. That's a very prime sort of thing. In active mage play, the thing most people know about mage is that, if you have forces, you can't make a fireball unless there's already fire there. But if you have forces and Prime, you can combine them to create that fire and create the fireball. Prime can be used to alter and transfer abstract and ineffable qualities, such as beingness and physicality. That is exactly what Jacob did with John Locke. When Jacob is killed and Esau kicks him into the fire, he burns up in flames and is reduced to ashes in no time. And Esau does look a little concerned about this. This is because at this point, for a few years now, Jacob has not really been a physical person. Metaphysically, he is only a mind and a shell, and that shell is what quickly burns down into the ashes as his remains. The rest of it has, for several years, been located inside John Locke. So John survives a really long fall from a very high window. Or does he? Because when he lands, he looks dead. It's only when Jacob touches him that he comes back to life. And I think what happened here is that Jacob interrupted John's death by transferring his own quality of aliveness to John. Most of it, at least. He needed to retain many metaphysical qualities of himself, such as, the ability to be ambulatory, which John, by breaking his spine, had lost. And, Jacob couldn't replace it because he needed that himself. When it came to staying alive, though, Jacob had infinite quintessence to draw from. So while other aspects of his personhood needed to be retained, that wasn't one of them. There was also, of course, still much of John Locke left. Fun little side note, in that scene, Jacob is reading a book called Everything That Rises Must Converge, which is exactly what he's doing, right? He's executing a plan from random noise. He's stirring up the sort of detritus of chaos. That book is also a short story collection, representing the many different lives touched by his actions. But this is why John couldn't walk unless he was on the island. It's not just that the island needed to heal him. Once he left, he immediately had an accident because the real world was trying to bring him back in line with his metaphysical pattern, which lacks the ability to be ambulatory. It was solidified to the extent that not even the island could heal him permanently. Why did Jacob do this? Is he stupid? He knew that Esau had developed a habit of changing into bodies that landed on the island recently. Who knows why he did it? Maybe he was bored. Eventually you get bored of the same body that you wear for 1,000 years. He certainly did it with Christian Shepherd's body, for instance. And given that we don't see him being played by Titus Welliver for over 100 years at least, suggests that he may have been doing this for a while. And he also knew that he wouldn't be able to resist doing it again, especially because it would put him in an excellent position to manipulate the remaining candidates and feel like he is winning. Now, when Jacob died, he became a wraith pretty much instantly. This is not surprising, he's a powerful mage on the island, yada yada. And wraiths have anchors in the physical world that secure their existence, things of dynamism and stasis. Jacob had 3 of these anchors, right? His mind, representing by the ashes of his body, his magic, represented by the cork doing its thing, that connection existing, and his body, which he had metaphysically transferred to John Locke, and which Esau had transferred onto himself. So when Jacob destroys his ashes, and when Desmond pulls the cork, All of that remaining Jacobness, especially his mortality, the very remnants of his physicality, coalesces entirely on Esau. It's no longer attuned to the vibrations of the island quintessence, the cork is out. Instead of a font of power accessible only to a mage, mortal corporeality becomes a weight that drags Esau down. And so while Esau is technically still a Malfian, he is now also a human in this half-underworld place. And thus, the rules of being human, the same rules that apply to mages, apply to him. But the last beautiful piece here, the dagger that ends up killing him, is that the person who shoots the final shot is Kate, who is no longer a candidate, and thus is no longer bound by the rules of being connected to Jacob, which may have prevented her from killing Esau. We don't know how far the extent of Mother's spell goes, but whom she is really killing is Jacob again, because Jacob's regular human aliveness can die. And it is by implication that Esau is killed by this as well. Perhaps Oblivion itself could have helped him, but Esau had at this point served his purpose, and Oblivion was busy cracking open the island so it could escape. So then Jack makes Hurley into the Protector, goes back into the Heart, puts the plug back in. He doesn't become a Malfian because unlike Esau, he is already attuned to the energies of the island. He is the Protector of the island right now. He takes in all its dynamism, not its entropy. He immediately becomes a Wraith then who very quickly, seeing his work done, finds a measure of peace. And that is how Jacob won. He didn't change the rules. He pulled a gambit of exceptions within exceptions and outplayed his opponent masterfully. Now, the morality of all that is questionable, but you know. Once you reach a level of power that high, morality becomes a little wonky. And okay, cool. That's the plot. What about the ending? What about the ending? The ending happens after the plot is over. It's a different stage of existence for these characters. Their carrier bag has often changed significantly, if you will. It's not difficult at all to contextualize this in the World of Darkness, though, and it's very interesting, so we'll do it. In the final scene in the church, we find out that everyone is dead. They've all been dead for a long time, though some of them, like Hurley, were probably alive for an unbelievable amount of time as well. It is the hope of all wraiths to one day be able to accept death and move on. That's part of the game, Wraith the Oblivion, to accept your end and contentedly go into the light. It's just that the underworld doesn't make this easy, like in any sense. I believe that the afterworld they find themselves in is one of the far shores. Mysterious and not well explained locations in the vast endless sea of the underworld that market themselves as places where wraiths can find peace outside of systems like the Stygian hierarchy, for instance, which you don't need to know anything about. Some of these places are bullshit, others are legitimate afterlives. And this one was made specifically for the people whose lives were touched and changed by the island. The Ferrymen, a very powerful organization in the underworld who are able to navigate the storm-racked sunless sea in all its variations, bring people to the far shores. Some ferrymen become wardens of these far shores, and those are known as Shining Ones. Ferrymen so ancient and powerful that they are effectively the equals of Charon, you know, from mythology, the founder of both the ferrymen and the Stygian hierarchy, which again you need to know nothing about. And I believe that Christian Shepherd is a Shining One. But wait, hang on, he died in 2004, how is that ancient or powerful at all? Okay, so in the very first season of Lost, right, one of the very first episode, Jack has visions of his father that over the course of that episode, where he fears he's going absolutely psychotic and everyone suggests he maybe should get some sleep, lead him to water and an empty coffin. We later discover that this was in fact Esau trying to manipulate him because Esau adopted Christian's body. This is also how he appears to Claire and how he gains her trust down the line. And because, you know, of course he's a walking fountain of Jhor, he infects her with the being evil disease rather quickly. That's That's why that happens, by the way. It's because he's a Malfian. He's literally made of darkness. Rousseau's crew was abducted by him. He turned them very quickly as well. In the cabin, it's also Esau wearing Christian's body. And the weird guy that shows up and where we only see his eye, I don't know who he is, actually. I'm not sure. He might just be some random ghost Esau forced into adding some flair and drama. Wouldn't be the first time that he's done it. Ben admits that the cabin has little to do with Jacob, though he does apparently hang out there sometimes. And Esau is at that point really trying to make Jacob appear sinister and evil to John Locke specifically. But Christian Shepherd still exists. He notably shows up to help John Locke put the wheel back into place. But this happens hundreds, if not thousands of years before he shows up on the island. So he'd been time traveling with them. And in the future, we don't see him again. So I think he got stuck in that distant past, and he had to find his own way off the island and out into the world. So he actually is a pretty old wraith. Factor number 2 is that he still has his body. Jack finds an empty coffin, right? And when Esau takes on the form of John Locke, John Locke's body is still there. Of course, all of the metaphysical attributes have been taken by Esau, but the meat is still present. I think that through the plane crash, because he was already dead, Christian's body actually fell right on the other side of the dividing line between the skin lands and the shadow lands of the island. This matters because when physical objects enter the underworld, they are immensely powerful and useful. They are called relics. Wraith fight wars over them. And so here is a wraith whose very corpus is a relic. Now, of course, this wouldn't stop Esau from adopting his form. He copies the metaphysical qualities of the form, though that process may have been what ultimately stopped Christian from ever interacting with the physical world ever again. Still, if he had ever run into the ferryman, he would have been a prime target for recruitment. He would have had a long journey of, spiritual growth and healing ahead of him, recovering from his, self, and finding new purpose in helping the dead find peace. This is why he would not interfere in the events of Lost. He understood their cosmic importance. Well, aside from that one time where he was trying to get the cosmic importance back on track. Though he did pick out for himself the luxury of collecting all the souls affected by them and bringing them to the far shore he had created so that they could make their peace and move on there. Them being on the plane that lands in LAX represents their souls being transported to the far shore. Who knows how much growth they had as wraiths in the meantime. The afterlife can be long, but their memories were altered significantly. Small little detail is Jack's surgical scar. Because when Jack died, it was part of his patent that he no longer had an appendix. Right, so it couldn't have been part of his corpus. And so a fake memory was not quite fully manufactured. We see the process of its creation by Jack's fake mother. Christian isn't there yet. He only arrives later. He's probably pretty busy with various preparations. It's pretty clear that his fake Los Angeles isn't just for characters from Lost. He does this sort of thing pretty regularly. It's literally his job. Though of course this time is a bit special because it includes his son, so it's a very personal event. But yeah, that's really the ending. That's all you need to understand about it. They move on because that's the purpose of that place. But it's not part of the plot anymore. So that's how everything makes sense within my theory, even the ending. But there's a bunch of other things that happen in this show which are incredibly fucking weird, and I'm here to talk to you about those now. First of all, mages. They're supposed to be pretty rare. How is the island full of them? How did that happen? Well, most of the people on the island are not mages. They are mortals that were brought there to the island as part of cults, as I said before. Some of them may be familiar with some of the ways of magic that have been created by mages, which in game terms would make them sorcerers. If the rote techniques of doing magic are ingrained enough into consensus, non-mages can do them if they know the right moves to pull. For instance, you know how to operate a cell phone and a microwave. Most of the mages are also not particularly powerful, the ones we see. Jacob is of course unspeakably mighty, and there's a few other impressive ones, but most of the characters are freshly awakened. And many of them are hampered by the fact that they don't necessarily recognize their abilities as magic, because they fit perfectly into an ordinary worldview. They do unlikely and exceptional things, but they're things that don't stretch disbelief too much, and the techniques they use to manifest them are not weird rituals but medical science and deception, visualizing that you believe in yourself, stuff like that. So who is and who isn't awakened? First, we're gonna start with like the irrelevant side characters that only show up, like 2 of them show up. Ashara, the one where like it's one of the worst episodes of Lost and Jack is a huge dick in it. She's a mage, she can see like fate, people's souls, stuff like that. She very clearly uses mysticism. Isaac of Uluru, the faith healer that Bernard takes Rose to, he is also clearly a mage, though he recognizes that he is not powerful enough to heal Rose's condition. But getting into the actual characters, Jack, I think, is awakened, though I'm not sure. He regularly pulls off medical miracles, but he also fails a lot, and I think he has too many demons to like progress down the path of enlightenment for himself. Kate we already know is a mage. I'm actually very certain in her case. Sawyer, no, he's a very capable con man, but he's clearly not woke. Juliet, mage, we talked about her. Ben Linus, not a mage, just a very capable mortal. His enemy, Charles Widmore, I think he's a mage, I'm pretty convinced, one who uses business as his instrument, but we don't see him that much, and he may just be a very skilled mortal as well. He certainly has a lot of secret knowledge, which, regardless of whether or not he is actually awakened, could make him a powerful sorcerer. Which is a good time to bring up Eloise. I think she's very much a mage, and a very powerful one at that. She specializes in the time sphere, and I think she awakens from the grief of killing her son shortly before she gives birth to him, which leads her to try to avoid that happening. Pretty natural impulse, I'd say. I feel like I understand why you would want to do that. But messing with time is a quick path to paradox, and so whatever she did failed, and she was sent to a paradox realm to learn her lesson. We see this paradox realm when Desmond, riding an explosion of quintessence and intricately connected to her fate, also ends up there. Which I, by the way, count as supporting evidence of my theory that the recharged quintessence sort of ends up in the upper umbra, because probably, we don't know this for sure, but it's very likely the case, paradox realms are pretty much adjacent to the upper umbra. So if the pockets of electromagnetism on the island are constantly radiating quintessence, an explosive discharge of such a pocket could blast a man's soul all the way up there. Eloise is very concerned with letting things go the path they are meant to go down, and tries to make Desmond do so as well. She has learned her lesson in the paradox realm, which is why she is back in reality a few years later to help the Oceanic Six get back to the island and bring the timeline back on track. Desmond, by the way, is not a mage, but he is an exceptional mortal engineered by Jacob to be an agent of fate that can withstand the damage of being exposed to pure quintessence. That's why he was blasted all the way up to the upper umbra and was fine. He eventually gets booted from Eloise's paradox realm when its spirits figure out that he just doesn't belong there, and his innate qualities allow his mind to resist being ripped apart by time shifting as well. He has a greater degree of permanence, which is why he survives his episode on the freighter, very good episode by the way, and why he can glimpse the afterworld even though it happens in the distant future. Jin and Sun, not mages, they don't do magic ever. Saeed, also not a mage. You might make an argument that is like the fact that he gets like proper intel from interrogation is a bit magical, so maybe he's a mage. Hurley we've talked about as well. I'm pretty sure he's a mage. He just stalls on his path to enlightenment, although I suppose he doesn't, because he does become the protector of the island. Mr. Echo, I have no actual reason to believe is a mage, even though I would like to. He doesn't really do magic, but he has a very mystical quality about him. And I'm pretty sure he was one of the candidates. We never do see all the names, and we also don't know that Echo Tunde is his actual full name. I bring him up because of his brother, Yemi, whose ghost has been trapped on the island for a while because he was on the plane that Echo was supposed to be on. And I think that as a wraith, he has fallen entirely to his shadow. He is a specter. Of all the ghosts we see, this is the one most diametrically opposed to his living personality. He is actively evil and manipulative, a willing participant in the smoke monster's quest to pick Echo off as a candidate. The three people from the freighter, Daniel Faraday, Charlotte Lewis, Miles Storm, all three mages, clearly we see them perform magic. Faraday uses weird science for time travel, Miles uses a different kind of weird science to talk to ghosts. Like, those two are perhaps the most classic mage-coded characters in this show. I could see them and their storylines in a campaign easily. We never see Charlotte do any magic, unfortunately. She doesn't get her own episode. I would have liked to see that. I would have liked to find out more about her. It's a shame, but she is a mage by association. They are also all three connected to the island. I think they were all born there, which probably aided in the process of their awakening, so Whitmore probably selected them because of those two factors. John Locke, now there is an interesting one. I think he's a mage. And of all the main characters, his instruments include the most mystical esoteric tools, right? He uses psychedelics, sweat lodges, visualization, that kind of stuff. But what I find really fascinating is that his magic is survival-based. Yes, he was a Boy Scout, but he didn't really become an expert survivalist until later in life, until he was in the wheelchair. And at that point, survivalism became a sort of religious pursuit for him, that he went far out of his way to make into a journey of self-discovery, until the Walkabout Company sort of put a stop to that. And so he manifests outcomes by engaging in impossibly good survival skills, which is just something I have never seen in this game. Mage, I would have loved to see it. Maybe I'll play a character like that one day. It's also what I believe the others do as their magic. They are, of course, mostly not awakened. They are sorcerers of survival magic, which is how they pull off the incredible feats of tracking and stealth that they pull off. Speaking of the others, B, I'm pretty sure, is a full-on mage. She just has that vibe and is one of the most mysterious characters in the show. I would have loved to learn a little bit more about her, to be honest. Then we have this guy, Mikhail Bakunin, who I was just absolutely obsessed with as a teenager. He was so cool and badass. And actually, one of my several names is Mikhail. And I don't think he's a mage, but I do think he is a type of supernatural being. I think Mikhail is a mummy. He's not an Amenti, he's not an Egyptian-style mummy. But in my recent video about Mummy the Resurrection, I did talk about other traditions of mummification, and the Soviet Union was among them. I think he's a Soviet mummy, and for some reason he left his old eternal life behind to work on the island. Not that it had been particularly eternal at that point, perhaps a few decades. He's one of Ben's most trusted associates, on par with Richard, so he's probably been on the island for a while. And the island protects him from whatever retribution is waiting for him for fleeing whatever his assigned duties were. He's already in the underworld, so when he dies here, he can just fall onto the other side of the local shroud instead of being whisked away to whatever ghost Soviet committee that mummies get dragged in front of when they die. And because the island is loaded with quintessence, instead of having to trudge around the underworld for months and years to get enough to restore his body to life, he can do it in minutes to hours. Just not perfectly. Instead of rejuvenating, he looks like a 40-year-old man pretty much every time, missing eye and everything. This means he might have survived his death in Season 3, and there's other reasons why we never see him on screen again. The Looking Glass Station is a little bit out there, so it's possible that the explosion that killed him casts him adrift in the wider underworld, not the island. In which case his soul might be in an underworld gulag right now. Dorgan, the guy who protects the temple, I have a lot to say about him. Look, I also thought he was just the coolest, and I think that in the context of World of Darkness, his character becomes all the more interesting. He talks about how he was a successful businessman in Osaka, and Jacob clearly targeted him for recruitment for a specific role that requires an inherent baseline understanding of the awakened world. He wouldn't be the only such person. Ilana was also specifically recruited, though for other reasons. I believe Dorgan was a member of the Technocratic Union, specifically of the Syndicate, the Money Mages, the Masters of Finance, who actually play a bigger role in the story of Lost than you might think. What happened to him, though, is that his entire worldview was turned on its head by the traumatic event of basically killing his son in a drunk car crash, and Jacob's offer to save him. The implication here being that the technocracy either couldn't save him or refused to do so. Maybe Dogen, or whatever his original name was before adopting the moniker of an ancient Buddhist monk, was not a very good technocrat. This explains why his magic is such a strange mix of like technology, herbalism, martial arts, and social domination. That's the background of a mage whose awakened worldview fundamentally shifted at one point. Which brings me to the temple in general. I've already mentioned that it's almost impossible to pin it onto a single culture, and I believe that this is because it's Jacob's sort of first attempt to build a society on the island, possibly one that involved many mages. There is Egyptian symbology in the temple, but you have to consider that ancient Egypt is a very old civilization that left its mark on the island, and several cultures of the past projected onto them sort of a mystical reverence. So anything Egyptian would work as a magical tool. And I reckon this might have been a rather heterogeneous little society affecting an Egyptian aesthetic for the purposes of mysticism. The chamber Locke leads Ben to, underneath the temple, was originally a cage made for Esau. Clearly, infrastructure exists to exert some level of control over him. Ben actually summons him to do his bidding, and it's entirely within the realm of the possible for mages to bind Amalthea. It's just, extremely dangerous. Which I reckon ended up being the original Temple Society's undoing. I think they may have been corrupted, perhaps permanently, by Esau, who managed to free himself and who also tainted the healing pool to be loaded with Jhor as much as it is quintessence. But the place still has strategic value, and so a second level of wards was constructed around the inner temple, which were then bound to the leader of that temple. And then another society was formed as traveling hunter-gatherers on the island itself, so that when one was corrupted, Jacob still had the other. Whenever this happened, might have also been the point in time when Jacob started to think of his candidate plan, because clearly trapping and binding Esau was not going to work. Many factions sought and found the island over the centuries, but in the context of World of Darkness, of course, the most noteworthy is the technocracy. The US military finds and explores the island as part of military tests in the 50s, and while it's possible they were just brought here as part of Jacob's plan, they might also have been, or perhaps they were just affiliated with, Void Engineers. Void Engineers are the part of the technocracy that explores distant reaches and unknown worlds outside of reality, and protects humanity from incursions from such places. They also have, spaceships. It's pretty cool. Whatever the case may have been, information about the island clearly found its way into the ranks of the technocracy, because they ended up sending a whole army of enlightened scientists with the Dharma Initiative. And as technocrats do, instead of harmonizing with the island's inherent mystical traditions, they just sort of imposed their own logic and order onto the place. And they were very effective in doing so. The technocracy does this thing where they show up calling themselves by any other name. Right? They don't call themselves technocracy. They like to be subtle. This is a horizon realm that might be confused for a real place to the uninitiated. Most of the non-mages on the base were being kept in the dark about the nature of things anyway, and these civilians would ultimately be rotated back into their regular lives, probably also serving the technocracy in some way. It would be unusual, but not impossible, that it's a regular technocracy operation. But I think the Dharma Initiative is a bit too weird and too spiritual in its beliefs to just be a technocratic venture. There's just too much namaste, too much psychedelics and whatnot. I think Dharma is a semi-rogue faction of enlightened scientists, probably many from the technocracy, financed by one particularly powerful mage in the syndicate, who, as we mentioned before, they're the technocracy's money mages. His name is Alvar Hanso, one of the most enigmatic figures in the Lost canon. And let's just say he wouldn't be the first technocracy money man driven to walk their own path with not quite official projects if they can see a profit down the line. There's several mages in the Dharma Initiative. First among them, Horace Goodspeed, whose job only refers to him as a mathematician, which does absolutely fit with the study of the primal utility elements of the island. Enlightened scientists love approaching the prime sphere from a standpoint of mathematics, because it's also a set of rules that exists somewhat independently of reality. It also makes sense that after the Swan disaster, with Horus being in charge and many of the other scientists being in a bit of a tough spot, he'd devise a mathematical solution to contain the primal energy, thus arriving at the numbers. Pierre Chang, mage, like Horus, he was part of the administration, but very involved with the Orchid time travel project. He is billed as a theoretical astrophysicist, so he probably specialized in dimensional science. That's what people who don't believe in spirits call the spirit sphere. Stuart Brzezinski, also an enlightened scientist, of course, some sort of physicist, but whatever he was trying to do at the Swan Station clearly ended up failing, and he paid the price by being stationed there for many years. To a certain extent, he is the Platonic ideal of the enlightened scientist. Very extremist in his worldview, bit of a recluse, loyal squad of goons. And another one, actually not very frequently remembered, Oldham. This guy, who only appears in one episode, is a chemist, and a guy who really stretches the definition of enlightened science with his wild psychedelics. He would have almost been more at home in the Sahajya tradition, but he chose this instead. We actually do see him do magic, because the drug he gives Saeed that just makes him tell the truth, no such thing exists. And for me personally, whenever I see something impossible happening in media these days, I just assume it's a mage who did it. And I'd say that's all of them. And look, yeah, most of the big characters, the important characters to us emotionally, even some of the most powerful characters in a way, like just socially, they're not mages. They're just people. And that doesn't actually make them any less important. Because World of Darkness is for telling stories about people. Those people may have grand supernatural powers, but they are fundamentally people, and they surround themselves with people who are just as much social creatures as they are. They're flawed in all the ways that everyone else is flawed. And the same is true about Lost. It's not about the magic and the mystery, the questions and the grand quest. I mean, it's also about that, obviously, much like the World of Darkness is also about vampires and ghosts, and that's cool. But it's first and foremost a story about human beings we get to know and whose journey we get to share. People we love or hate, whom we want to see thrive or fail. That's why the ending doesn't answer all the questions. It's why you had to wait almost 20 years for me to explain all that to you. Now, do I think they actually wrote this show with World of Darkness in mind? Absolutely the fuck not. No, this was a cool show that was way more successful than the showrunners expected. It relied on a good mystery writing as much as it did good character writing, and it was ultimately veered way off course because of the writers' strike. That shit hit Lost like a freight train. The show would have been way better if the studios hadn't created the sort of untenable conditions that led to the strike. People always say, oh, they didn't know what they were doing from the start, they didn't already have all the answers. And there is a lot of truth to that, but like, come on. This was one of the first shows that brought stories with meaningful change, where you couldn't just pop into any old episode to like general television. That was like pretty much entirely the domain of cable TV back then. They did a really good job, and I love it. I love Lost. It's one of my favorite shows, and even though obviously it is flawed and very stupid at times, I will always love it. And because I'm a World of Darkness nerd, it even makes sense to me. Thank you very much for watching this video. Like, comment, subscribe, share this to your relevant communities. Consider buying some of my merchandise or my novel over here, Harm's Place. Or, you know, hold off on that for 72 hours, or probably a bit longer than 72 hours, I still have to do all the paperwork. And like, go share the link in the description for a chance at one of those 5 digital copies, as explained at the start of the video. If you're thinking about getting into Lost again, there's actually a very interesting project floating out in the ether over there called Chronologically Lost, in which the entire show is put into chronological order. Like, every single scene is in chronological order. It's pretty cool. And see you around, losers. No, hang on, that's insulting. I don't want to insult people.